영어 동화 세상 리틀팍스.
Oliver Twist, Chapter 1, A Poor Beginning. Among the buildings in the dreary town of Mudfog was a workhouse, where the poor were housed and many of them were worked to death. Oliver Twist was born in this dismal place, but for a few minutes it was doubtful he would survive. At last he breathed, sneezed, and let out a loud wail. Hearing this, a young woman raised her head feebly from her pillow. "Let me see the child and die." "Oh, you must not talk about dying yet," said the doctor who had attended the birth. "Bless her heart, no," said the old pauper woman who was serving as nurse. "Think about being a mother to your new baby, dear." The young mother stretched out her hand toward the child. The doctor deposited the baby in her arms. She imprinted her cold lips passionately on his forehead, shuddered, and died. "It's all over," said the doctor. "She was a nice-looking girl. Where did she come from?" "She was brought here last night," replied the old woman. "She was found lying in the street. But where she came from or where she was going, nobody knows." The doctor leaned over the body. "The same old story." He shook his head. "No wedding ring. Well, good night. If the child cries, give it a little gruel." Wrapped in an old calico blanket, Oliver cried lustily. If he had known he was a workhouse orphan, he would have cried even louder. When Oliver was about 8 months old, he was sent to a branch workhouse, a farm run by an elderly woman. Mrs. Mann was a woman of wisdom and experience. She knew what was good for the children under her care, and she knew what was good for her. So she took the greater part of their weekly stipends for her own use and fed the children as little as possible. By his 10th birthday, Oliver was a pale child, small for his age and quite thin. But luckily, nature had planted a good, sturdy spirit in Oliver's heart, for he was spending his birthday locked in the coal cellar with 2 other orphans for daring to be hungry. Mrs. Mann looked out the window and saw a large, fat man fumbling with the latch on the front gate. "The parish officer is here," she cried to her servant. "Take Oliver and those 2 brats upstairs and wash them right away before Mr. Bumble sees them." "Why is this gate locked?" The man rattled the gate as Mrs. Mann appeared. "You're keeping a parish officer waiting, and I am here on official business." "How delightful to see you, Mr. Bumble." Mrs. Mann opened the gate. "I was just telling the dear children, who are so fond of you, that you're here." Mrs. Mann ushered him into the parlor, where he removed his hat and they sat down. "Oliver Twist is 10 years old today," said Mr. Bumble. "Bless him," interrupted Mrs. Mann. "And despite offering a reward of £10, later increased to £20, the parish has never been able to discover the names of his parents." "Then how did he get a name?" Mr. Bumble drew himself up with pride. "I name all the orphans in alphabetical order. The last was Swubble, then Twist, then Unwin. But returning to business, Oliver is too old to remain here. I've come myself to take him back to the workhouse, so let me see him at once." Mrs. Mann went to fetch Oliver. "Make a bow to the gentleman, Oliver," she said when they returned. Oliver bowed. "Very good, Oliver. Now come along with me." And with that, Mr. Bumble put on his hat and bade the surprised Mrs. Mann good day. Mr. Bumble walked quickly down the road with little Oliver clutching his coat cuff. "Are we nearly there?" Oliver gasped every quarter mile. "Not yet," Mr. Bumble said with growing impatience. At last they arrived at a huge prison-like building. "You've come here to be taught a useful trade," said Mr. Bumble. "Starting tomorrow morning at 6 o'clock, you'll pick apart old ropes so they can be reused." Oliver barely had time to look around before he was hurried away to receive his dreary uniform. That night he sobbed himself to sleep on a hard bed in a room full of other boys. 3 months passed. The board running the workhouse decided that too many poor people were taking advantage of its services. To reduce the number of paupers, they drastically reduced the amount of food. Now each boy was allowed only 1 small bowl of gruel. The boys were fed in a great stone hall. Once a day, the master of the workhouse, assisted by two women, ladled out the gruel from a large copper pot.
"If I don't get more to eat,"
said a new boy,
"I might have to eat one of you."
he glared at the other boys with a wild, hungry look in his eyes, frightening them. That night, the boys decided that someone had to ask the master for more food. They drew lots, and Oliver got the job. The next evening, the boys arrived in the dining hall. They stood in line while the master filled their bowls. Then they sat down, and the gruel quickly disappeared. The boys whispered to each other and winked at Oliver. Oliver was desperate with hunger and reckless with misery. He rose from the table and walked toward the master.
"Please, sir,"
Oliver held up his bowl.
"I want some more."
The master aimed a blow at Oliver's head with his ladle. "Call Mr. Bumble!" The parish officer came running from a board meeting, and when he heard Oliver's request, he ran right back. "I beg your pardon, Mr. Limpkins," Mr. Bumble said to the head of the board. "Oliver Twist has asked for more food." There was horror on every face in the room.
"For more?"
said Mr. Limpkins.
"Compose yourself, Bumble, and answer me. Do I understand he asked for more after he'd eaten the amount allotted to him?"
"He did, sir," replied Mr. Bumble.
"That boy will come to a bad end."
Mr. Limpkins shook his head, and no one disagreed. Oliver was instantly locked up. The next morning, a notice was posted on the workhouse gate offering £5 to anyone who wanted an apprentice. In other words, they were looking for anyone who would take Oliver Twist off the hands of the parish. Oliver Twist, Chapter 2, A New Home. Oliver was confined to a dark and lonely room for a week after he had dared to ask for more gruel. No one responded to the notice offering him as an apprentice. The workhouse board began to think about sending him to sea to work as a cabin boy. The board members sent Mr. Bumble out to make some inquiries to ship captains. He was just returning to the workhouse when he met the village undertaker, Mr. Sourberry, at the gate. "I've come for the two women who died last night," said Mr. Sourberry as he cordially stepped forward and shook Mr. Bumble's hand. "You'll make a fortune when the board pays you, Mr. Sourberry," said Mr. Bumble. The undertaker shook his head. "The amount paid by the board for the paupers' coffins is very small." "So are the coffins." Mr. Bumble allowed himself only a smile because he was an important official. But Mr. Sourberry was very amused by the joke and laughed for a long time. "Well, Mr. Bumble," he said at last, "there's no denying that the coffins are somewhat narrower since you started feeding the paupers less." That reminded the parish officer of Oliver. "You don't know anybody who wants an apprentice, do you?" Mr. Bumble raised his cane to the notice on the gate and gave 3 raps on the words, £5. "That's the very thing I wanted to speak to you about. I pay so much in taxes to support the poor, I have a right to get a lot out of them. So I'll take the boy myself." Mr. Bumble grasped the undertaker by the arm and hurried him into the workhouse. Within 5 minutes, the board decided that Oliver should go to Mr. Sourberry immediately for a month's trial period. That evening, Oliver was brought before the board and informed that he was to become an apprentice to the undertaker.
"And if you ever complain or come back to this workhouse again, you will be sent to sea,"
said Mr. Limpkins, the head of the board.
"Do you understand, boy?"
Oliver nodded and showed no emotion.
"Oh, he's a hardened young rascal,"
said Mr. Limpkins as Oliver was led away by Mr. Bumble. The other board members nodded in agreement. So Oliver pulled his cap over his eyes, picked up the small brown paper parcel that contained all his belongings, and once more attached himself to Mr. Bumble's coat cuff. For some time Mr. Bumble drew Oliver along without noticing him. This was partly because the parish officer held his head high, as an important parish officer always should. And this was also because it was a windy day. Little Oliver was completely hidden by Mr. Bumble's coat whenever it blew open. As they drew near their destination, however, Mr. Bumble thought he should make sure that the boy was ready for inspection by the undertaker. "Oliver," said Mr. Bumble.
"Yes, sir,"
replied Oliver in a low, tremulous voice.
Pull that cap off your eyes and hold up your head.
Oliver immediately did what he was told. As he was pushing up his cap, a tear fell on his hand. And as Mr. Bumble gazed sternly upon him, another tear rolled down his cheek. It was followed by another and another. Oliver covered his face with both hands and wept. Mr. Bumble glared at Oliver.
Well, of all the most ungrateful and worst-behaved boys that I have ever seen, Oliver, you are the—
No, no, sir,
Oliver sobbed.
I will be good. Indeed, sir, I will. I am a very little boy, sir, and it's so—
So what? Mr. Bumble asked in amazement.
so lonely, sir. So very lonely. Everybody hates me. Oh, please don't be angry with me.
For a moment, Mr. Bumble regarded Oliver with some astonishment.
Ahem. Well, yes. Ahem. Oh, this troublesome cough,
said the parish officer. He cleared his throat and managed to keep the tears from his own eyes.
Now dry your eyes and be a good boy,
he finally said to Oliver. He took Oliver's hand and they walked on in silence. Mr. Sowerberry was busy making some entries in a ledger when they arrived at his shop.
Here, said Mr. Bumble. I brought the boy.
Oliver made a bow.
Oh, that's the boy, is it?
The undertaker raised his candle to get a better view of Oliver.
Mrs. Sowerberry, will you have the goodness to come here a moment, my dear?
Mrs. Sowerberry emerged from a little room behind the shop.
My dear, said Mr. Sowerberry, this is the boy from the workhouse that I told you about.
Oliver bowed again.
Oh my,
said the undertaker's wife.
He's very small. Yes, he is rather small,
agreed Mr. Bumble.
But he'll grow. I dare say he will grow once he starts eating our food and drink, said Mrs. Sowerberry. I see no saving in employing workhouse children, for they always cost more than they're worth. But men always think they know best. Get downstairs, little bag of bones.
With that, Mrs. Sowerberry opened a door and pushed Oliver down a steep flight of stairs to the kitchen. A servant girl was sitting in the kitchen, which was a damp, dark room just outside the cellar.
Here, Charlotte,
said Mrs. Sowerberry, who had followed Oliver downstairs.
Give this boy the cold meat scraps you were saving for the dog. That animal hasn't come home all day, so he'll have to do without. I'm sure this boy isn't too fussy to eat them. Are you, boy?
Oliver's eyes lit up at the mention of meat.
Oh, no, ma'am.
Charlotte set a plate of meat scraps before him, and Oliver gobbled up the dog's food. In silent horror, Mrs. Sowerberry watched Oliver eat. If he was this hungry now, how much would he eat when he was bigger?
Well,
she said when Oliver had finished his supper.
Are you done?
Oliver looked around the kitchen. There was nothing more to eat within his reach.
Yes,
he said.
Then come with me.
Mrs. Sowerberry picked up a dim and dirty lamp and led the way upstairs.
Your bed's under the counter. You don't mind sleeping among the coffins?
Oliver hesitated on the stairs.
Well, it doesn't matter whether you do or don't because you can't sleep anywhere else, said Mrs. Sowerberry. Come on, don't keep me here all night.
Oliver meekly followed his new mistress upstairs. Oliver Twist, Chapter 3, The Undertaker's Apprentice.
Open the door.
The next morning, Oliver woke up because someone was loudly kicking the front door of the undertaker's shop.
Open the door,
cried the voice again.
Yes, sir,
replied Oliver, struggling into his clothes.
Are you the new boy?
asked the voice through the keyhole.
Yes, sir,
replied Oliver.
Then I'll beat you up when I get in, workhouse brat.
Having made this dreadful promise, the voice began to whistle. Oliver turned the key with a trembling hand and opened the door. He glanced up and down the street, but all he could see was an older boy sitting on a hitching post and eating a slice of bread.
I beg your pardon, sir,
Oliver said at last.
Did you knock?
I kicked.
Did you want a coffin, sir?
Oliver innocently inquired.
You'll be wanting a coffin soon if you keep this up. You don't know who I am, do you?
The boy jumped down from the post.
No, sir.
I'm Mr. Noah Claypole, and you work for me. Take down the shutters, you idle young ruffian. Noah watched as Oliver struggled to remove the heavy shutters from the windows and stow them beside the house, where they were kept during the day. When Oliver finished, he followed Noah down to the kitchen for breakfast.
Come sit near the fire, Noah,
said Charlotte.
I saved you a nice piece of bacon from Master's breakfast.
Then she told Oliver to take some stale bread and sit in the coldest corner of the kitchen.
Hurry up, because Master will want you to mind the shop.
Do you hear, Workhouse? Said Noah. Hurry up.
Oh, leave him alone,
said Charlotte. But Noah didn't want to leave Oliver alone. He finally had someone who ranked below him. However, the undertaker soon realized that Oliver was someone special. Young Twist is a good-looking boy, said Mr. Sowerberry to his wife one night at supper. He should be, replied Mrs. Sowerberry. He eats enough. There's an expression of melancholy in his face, which is very interesting, my dear. He'd make a delightful mourner at funerals. Mrs. Sowerberry looked at him quizzically. I don't mean a regular mourner at adult funerals, continued Mr. Sowerberry. I'd use him only at children's funerals. It would be delightful to see a small mourner walking with a small coffin. Oliver soon had a chance to acquire a great deal of experience as a mourner. Thanks to an outbreak of measles, he led many processions to the graveyard. After a month, he was formally apprenticed to the undertaker. Noah was jealous of Oliver's promotion to mourner and so continued to harass him. One day while they were eating, Noah was determined to make Oliver cry. The older boy pulled Oliver's hair and pinched his ears. Workhouse, how's your mother? Said Noah.
She's dead, replied Oliver. Don't you say anything about her.
What did she die of, Workhouse?
Of a broken heart. That's what I was told.
A tear rolled down Oliver's cheek. Oh, what's made you cry?
Not you,
Oliver replied sharply.
Don't say anything more about her.
You might as well know, Workhouse, that your mother was a bad one. If she hadn't died, she'd have ended up in jail. Crimson with fury, the little boy overturned the table. Oliver grabbed Noah and knocked him to the ground. A minute earlier, Oliver had looked like a quiet, dejected creature. But the insult to his mother had set his blood on fire. He's trying to murder me, shouted Noah.
Charlotte, Mrs. Sowerberry, help me. Oliver's gone mad.
The two women rushed downstairs into the kitchen.
You little wretch,
screamed Charlotte, grabbing Oliver by one arm.
Oh, you ungrateful, murderous, horrid villain!
And with every word she smacked Oliver. Mrs. Sowerberry and Noah joined in the melee. The three of them managed to drag the struggling boy into the cellar, where they slammed the door and locked it tight. Oliver kicked and kicked the door from the inside. Mrs. Sowerberry sank into a chair and burst into tears.
Oh, Charlotte! It's a blessing we haven't all been murdered in our beds. He'll kick that door down and Mr. Sowerberry is away, said Charlotte.
Noah, run to Mr. Bumble and tell him to come here right now, said Mrs. Sowerberry.
Noah ran to the workhouse gate, where he stopped for a moment to make himself look as pitiful as possible. Then he shouted,
Mr. Bumble! Mr. Bumble!
The parish officer was so alarmed by these cries that he rushed outside with his hat in his hand.
What's happened? Mr. Bumble said breathlessly. Has Oliver run away?
No, sir, but he tried to murder us. Mr. Sowerberry is out, so Mrs. Sowerberry wants you to come and flog Oliver.
Mr. Bumble put on his hat and tapped his cane on the ground.
Let's go.
They hurried to the undertaker's shop, where Oliver was still kicking the cellar door and Mrs. Sowerberry and Charlotte were waiting in fear.
Oliver, shouted Mr. Bumble through the keyhole.
Let me out!
Do you know who's speaking to you?
Yes.
Aren't you afraid of me?
No,
Oliver replied boldly. Mr. Bumble staggered back in surprise.
He must be mad, said Mrs. Sowerberry. No boy in his right mind would dare speak to you like that. It's not madness, ma'am. It's meat. If you had kept the boy on gruel, this never would have happened.
Just then Mr. Sowerberry returned. After hearing what Oliver had done, he dragged the boy from the cellar and beat him. Mr. Bumble shook his head.
All you can do now is leave him in the cellar for a day or so until he's a little starved. Then take him out and keep him on gruel through his apprenticeship.
So they left Oliver in the cellar for the rest of the day with a slice of bread and some water. That night, Mrs. Sowerberry ordered him upstairs to bed. As he looked around the dismal undertaker's workshop, Oliver fell on his knees and wept. For a long time he remained motionless, but finally he got up and opened the door. Outside, it was a cold, dark night, and the stars seemed very far away. Oliver softly closed the door. He tied up his few articles of clothing into a handkerchief. Then he sat on a bench to wait for morning. When the first ray of daylight struggled through the shutters, Oliver opened the door. He took one last look around the shop. Then he stepped out into the street.